Good afternoon, and welcome to How to Pass the GED Social Studies exam, Part 2. This is the second video of a three-part series. The topics we will be discussing today are making inferences, making connections between different social studies elements such as peoples, events, places, and processes. Then we'll cover the effect of different social studies concepts on an argument or point of view. We'll be identifying bias and propaganda in social studies readings. And finally, we'll be applying mathematical reasonings in social studies. So when you take the social studies GED exam, you'll be asked to make inferences. Sometimes authors often use evidence to guide the reader to draw conclusions. You'll be asked to make inferences or draw conclusions by applying your logic and reasoning skills to the evidence presented in social studies reasonings. For example, you may be provided with several pieces of evidence about a particular historical event, and then you'll have to infer what the most likely outcome might be in the future. So now let's give it a try. A recent magazine article examined the government in the United States during the first decades after the independence from Britain. Which quotation from the article allows a reader to infer that the power of the U.S. government is limited? A fear of tyranny led to the creation of a national government under the Articles of Confederation, which lasted less than a decade. B, as a result, the founders drafted the U.S. Constitution, which addressed weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation. C, the U.S. Constitution, ratified over 200 years ago, greatly changed the relationship between the national and state governments. Or D, the U.S. Constitution included safeguards to protect individual rights against abuse by the government. Which answer did you choose? The correct answer is D. The U.S. Constitution included safeguards to protect individual rights against abuse by the government. You also be asked to make connections between different social studies elements such as peoples, events, places, and process. You'll be asked to analyze cause and effect relationships, describe those connections. You have to put events in order and understand the steps in a process. For example, how does a bill become a law? And lastly, you'll be asked to analyze that relationship of events, processes, or ideas. For example, you might have to analyze whether earlier events actually caused later ones or simply occurred before them. So here's another example. An author writing about World War I might cite events leading up to the war, including political and social events. In the years prior to World War I, social unrest fueled by food shortages led to riots. Deposed Russian leadership left a dangerous power vacuum, and at the same time, increasingly aggressive clashes arose between world empires. So now, let's give it a try. Here's an article on Reconstruction policies. After President Lincoln's assassination in April of 1865, President Andrew Johnson and the radical Republicans in Congress battled for control of Reconstruction. The battle included settings the conditions for former Confederate states to be readmitted to the Union. President Johnson wanted even milder conditions than those that had been proposed by Lincoln. The radical Republicans demanded policies that punished the South and ensured civil rights for African Americans. By 1866, enough radical Republicans had been elected to Congress to override Johnson's vetoes. Over the next 2 years, Congress passed a series of Reconstruction Acts. All the former Confederate states except one were placed under military control. These acts also required each state to accept the 14th and 15th Amendments, which granted political and voting rights to African American men. It was under these conditions that the remaining Confederate states returned to the Union. So, which events in the passage happened second? A. Republicans in Congress took control of Reconstruction. C. President Lincoln proposed mild conditions for states to rejoin the Union. Or D. Radical Republicans and President Johnson disagreed over Reconstruction policies. You may stop the video and rewind if necessary. And let's go ahead and finish up those answers. And pencils down. Which answer did you choose? The correct one is D. Radical Republicans and President Johnson disagreed over Reconstruction policies. Also covered on the social studies GED exams are the effect of different social studies concepts on an argument or point of view. All social studies authors have a point of view and purpose for what they write. On the exam, you'll be asked to analyze how events and situations shape the author's point of view. Then you'll have to evaluate whether the author's evidence is factual, relevant, and sufficient. You will be using that information to make judgments about how different ideas impact the author's argument. For example, an author might present their point of view that nonviolent approaches are the most effective way to impact government policy. They could present evidence from the movement to resist British rule in India, led by Mohandas Gandhi, alongside evidence from the American Civil Rights Movement in the United States, led by Martin Luther King Jr. So now you give it a try. Much of the 20th century was marked by conflict between the ideas of communism and capitalism. Which term is associated with the idea of communism? A. Profit motive. B. Private property. C. Classless society. Or D. Competitive market. The correct answer is C. Classless society. You'll also be asked to identify bias and propaganda in social studies readings. And you'll be asked to identify when a social studies reading uses bias or propaganda. Sometimes authors promote their point of view by appealing to a reader's emotions. They may also use loaded language, which are words that trigger emotions, to lead the reader into understanding the author's point of view. For example, during the Cold War, as tensions rose between the United States and the Soviet Union, many Americans worried that communism could destroy American society. This worry was fueled by writings describing communism as an iceberg that could sink America, or as purgatory under communism. Which publication is best example of propaganda? A website that lists the federal taxes paid by individuals at different income levels. B, a newspaper article that quotes a senator who argues that federal income taxes are too high. C, a wartime cartoon that claims American citizens who fail to pay taxes are helping the enemy. Or D, a pamphlet written by a socialist group that describes the history of taxes on wealthy American citizens. And which answer did you choose? The correct answer is C, a wartime cartoon that claims American citizens who fail to pay taxes are helping the enemy. Our last topic for today is applying mathematical reasoning in social studies. You will be using data presented in visual form, including maps, charts, graphs, and tables. That data can be presented in many different visual forms, which also include maps, photographs, and cartoons. You will be asked to make sense of information that is presented in different ways and use that information to analyze information from maps, tables, charts, photographs, and political cartoons. You will be representing that textual data into visual forms and then interpret and use and create graphs with appropriate labeling and then use data to predict trends. For example, a line graph can show the population growth of a city before and through the Industrial Revolution. You may be asked to predict future growth for the city. And this concludes our second video of a three-part series. If you have any questions, feel free to contact me by email.